In contrast to the honourable gentleman who've just spoken, perhaps I can start a little quieter by saying a few words on behalf of my predecessor as Member of Parliament for North East Bedfordshire, Alistair Burt, who served the constituencies of Bury North and North East Bedfordshire for the period from 1983 until standing down the last election, with a very short break between 1997 and 2001. I got to know Alistair in 1984, and on almost every political issue, he and I often found ourselves in accordance, with the great exception of our views on the membership of the European Union. Well, also on football. Alistair loves it, me not so much. But Alistair, in addition to being well respected across his house, also had great knowledge and understanding of the Middle East, an issue which he continues to pursue, and had that unique ability to be trusted on all sides. Now, Mr. Speaker, I should just point, as the Register of Interest hasn't been yet published, just point to honourable members, given some things I might say, that I'm a director of software companies. Mr. Speaker, a new dawn beckons, and a new government is formed to set the initial course for our country, a course to shape the success or failure of our refound independence. The most likely error this government will make will be to underestimate the scale of the opportunity for change, that this government will prefer the comforts of the known rather than the uncertainties of the unknown, that the voices of well-connected incumbents will drown out those of precocious challengers. This is not a time for a government to take timid steps, but to take giant strides. Every ounce of radicalism which is lost today will be repaid in pounds of future regret for opportunities lost. Our country needs this government to argue with that fierce urgency of now that President Obama summoned America to embrace a decade ago. And I would like to outline 3 areas from the Queen's speech where I believe that radicalism can take place. For decades, competitive capitalism has driven enormous gains in human progress. But the case for capitalism also now appears tarnished from the consequences of globalization, from regulatory capture, and from repeated examples of corporate excess. This home of Smith, of Locke, of Ricardo is best placed to remake the global case for capitalism for a new century as we define our new role in the world. At the heart of this case, we must place the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, the startups, and the innovators. The government should also review the primacy of shareholder value as the sole mission for our companies. We should simplify the governance code, yes, but also give oversight more clout, so excesses are more effectively curtailed, and so companies are more accountable for the externalities of their actions. We need measures to weaken the grip of crony capitalism, dysfunctional privatizations, public contracts repeatedly handed to the same as before conglomerates as the only game in town, disallowing the socialization of losses from private risk-taking, and yes, reviewing our corporate tax breaks. As we leave the EU, we should not inadvertently leave out the welcome mat, encouraging lobbyists to decamp from Brussels to Westminster, or for that matter, York. We need measures to provide people with swifter redress and greater protection from business and regulatory failure. For example, in my own area, the simplest thing of a local plan not being accepted, you get creepy private developers trying to put in developments in that short space of time between plans. Constituents of mine in Willington, in Harrold, in Ravensden and Potton, having to deal with a lifetime change just from one small bureaucratic failure. And the UK should make free markets and free trade hallmarks of our foreign policy. I see the Prime Minister is back from his UK-Africa Investment Summit, and that was precisely the place he should be today. And I urge him to place a trade deal with Africa at the core of our new relationship, one that casts off the protectionism of the EU and that reasserts the value of free trade over development aid. An imperative for government action, an urgent imperative, is for reform of markets based on the utilisation of data and, more specifically, the actions of digital platforms. The evidence of externalities in these markets is compelling. The undermining of local accountability through the impact on local newspapers, the unquantified but evident impact on mental health and well-being, and the unequalled political leverage dispensed by the machine learning models remote from inspection or democratic insight. These only hint at the scale of the potential distortion of competitive capitalism, a distortion in which we are willing, gullible participants. The extraction of our data from our actions and of our preferences to enable predictive analysis to be sold for profit make British citizens in this century the equivalent of those exploited by colonial powers in earlier centuries. These new colonists, these casual exploiters of our future tense, require intelligent, more demanding regulation. We need accountability in our infrastructure. Recent announcements by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, indicate that he understands the necessity for radicalism. His proposed infrastructure fund, his commitment to changing investment algorithms to give the regions a fighting chance, and his declaration that no industry should expect the state to relegate the national interest to their private interests in our trade negotiations with the EU. May I encourage him further with three thoughts. First of all, Mr. Speaker, he should maintain fiscal discipline and not use the current experience of low interest rates as a windfall, but rather as a way for reshaping public pensions. Secondly, he should create compelling tax incentives that support local community investing in local free trade zones. And finally, he needs an early cross-departmental example of an infrastructure bid that makes sense. And I have an oven-ready deal. North East Bedfordshire is already shouldering a substantial amount of the nation's need for housing. We already see across the constituency shortages of public services like GPs. We await very shortly announcements on East-West Rail. We have a long-standing need for the realignment of the A1, which will be a benefit not only for constituents of mine, but also for those in the Midlands, as we heard earlier in the debate. I say, Mr. Speaker, that this is the deal. This is the example that my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, I'm sure, in his speech will want to point to as precisely what we need as this government embarks on the next stage in our country's great future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.